John Penrose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I start by saying I am seriously pleased to see this bill coming forward. It is much needed, not just because it is a fulfilment of our international obligations, as the right honourable lady for the Labour front bench has just pointed out, but because, as the Secretary of State rightly pointed out in his remarks, before we had any kind of proper subsidy control regime, before we went into the EU, it was pretty much a free-for-all, and I'm afraid to say that no matter who was in government, broadly speaking, the lack of rules was terrible. Politicians of all sides, of all stripes, over a long and extended period of time, have a dreadful track record in yielding to temptation, particularly when they are being lobbied hard by somebody who is pleading desperately for this or that piece of help. Just one more wafer-thin subsidy, sir. And we give way. All of us do. It is, I'm afraid, only human, and it is a long-proven fact that politicians are terrible at picking winners, but losers are really good at picking politicians. And that is a long-proven fact. So it is absolutely essential that we have this rules-based system in place as we come out of the EU, and that we have our UK-only version of it. And the Secretary of State is absolutely right to move towards that, even if we didn't have international obligations in order to deliver it as well. I'm also pleased to see the 7 principles, and it's backed up by various other environmental principles as well, but the sort of 7 core principles are the sort of core of that set of approach, and starting with the notion that it has to be a market failure before you are allowed to start dishing out any form of taxpayers' cash, because we can all think of businesses in the past, perhaps even today, who would like nothing better, Madam Deputy Speaker, than to reach their sticky fingers into the taxpayers' pockets and extract some cash in order to make their lives better, in order to make their shareholders' lives simpler, in order to make their management's lives easier as well. And therefore it is absolutely right that the Secretary of State has made sure that he has limited his own freedom, and more particularly that of his successors, so that we have an approach which will be, we hope, consistent, and there will not be open season for government failure. We always talk about market failure in this place, Madam Deputy Speaker, but this is crucial for avoiding government failure in future. It's a point which I made in the Government Commission report, which I was asked to write by the Secretary of State's predecessor as a report to the government about competition policy. Self-denial is absolutely essential here in order to make sure that we don't start splashing around taxpayers' cash in an unproductive way and subsidising commercially hopeless cases because they've got good lobbyists. And the trouble with it is that the more hopeless they are, but the deeper pockets they have, the better lobbyists they have, the harder it is to avoid that kind of temptation. So this is a welcome bill, it is a necessary bill, it is vitally important, and as my right honourable friend said earlier on, I don't think we should have any truck with the notion that just because we weren't one of the most prolific users of subsidies when we were still part of the EU and we ranked relatively low in the league table of other countries within the EU in our use of subsidies, and that I think as a free marketeer, that should be a badge of honour, Madam Deputy Speaker. That shows that we are allowing, in general, capitalism to run, and for capitalist animal spirits to move resources, to move investment, to move productive assets around our economy in the most efficient way to drive our economic growth. And ultimately, it is that economic growth which pays for the public services which we all care about and which we all need and rely on as well. So, yes to capitalism, yes to avoiding distortions and discriminations, and dare I say it, potentially, if we don't have these rules in place, the risks of political favouritism if we don't have a rules-based system. So I am delighted that this bill is here, and it establishes some really important principles for all of us. There is one small fly in the ointment, there's, I'm afraid, which I will just mention now. I don't want to try your patience, Madam Deputy Speaker, by going into things which will be properly covered, I'm sure, at both the committee and report stages, but just to mention the principle at this stage. And it's already been mentioned by my honourable friend for Thursker Moulton and also by others as well. And this is a point about transparency. Again, the Secretary of State has made absolutely a central point of this, and he's absolutely right to say that he wants to establish the UK as one of the leading examples of subsidy transparency, I think, in the world. I may be misquoting him slightly, but the principle is, I'm sure, one which he would sign up to. And that is an absolutely core piece, because if we don't have that transparency, if we can't see what these subsidies are, or we can't see what they are until it's too late, then how on earth are we to know that this excellent new set of rules-based principles are being followed properly or not? Sunlight is the best disinfectant, as we all know. Exposing it to public scrutiny cannot be bad, and because we are setting up these rules-based systems, we should have nothing to hide. If we are worried about transparency, that's always a bad sign in the first place, and therefore the central principle, which the Secretary of State and his fellow ministers have already enunciated, is entirely the right one. My concern, Madam Deputy Speaker, is therefore not with the principle that he's enunciated, it's whether or not this bill will actually deliver the principle in the way that he hopes. So it's a technical concern, not one of principle at all. But the technical concern is real, and it's because at the moment, or as we have left the EU's basic rules for disclosure require you to disclose subsidies above €500,000. The new bill, as we've already heard, has a variety of different exemptions, but broadly speaking, it requires you to disclose subsidies above £500,000. So that means that we will be disclosing fewer subsidies in future than we were under the EU, because the threshold is higher. It's not the only threshold, there are other thresholds. One of them is even higher still, 725,000 for public interest subsidies of one kind or another, which I think is subsidising things like buses and social housing. All things which may very well need subsidy, but why are we being secretive about it? Why shouldn't we make this public? Absolutely happy to give way.
I think we're away on this point. Would he also extend that to the exclusions? There are very specific exclusions for inclusion on the central database. Would he extend his argument to the consideration of those excluded items as well?
I thank him for his intervention. And there are a couple of exclusions, I think, which make an awful lot of sense. For example, an exclusion about national security, which I'm sure, I hope everybody on all sides of this House would sign up to. But in principle, to follow and frank the principle which the Secretary of State has rightly put across, that we want to be the most transparent about our use of subsidies, because it will then show that we are following those rules, because it will then show that we are letting capitalism rip, and that therefore productive assets are being used in the most effective way without distortions, then in general there should be fewer exclusions, the minimum number of exclusions which is safe, but there will still need to be some, I completely accept. And I don't think that there is any particular reason why we should worry about disclosing pretty much any subsidy, frankly. But particularly because, Madam Deputy Speaker, local councils, for example, already have to report anything they spend above, I think it's £500. They're already taking records, they're already keeping notes, they're already publishing these details anyway. It would be peculiar, I think, wouldn't it, to say they've got to declare all their spending above £500, but they don't have to declare their subsidies above £500,000. I'm not sure that it's terribly consistent. Equally, the Secretary of State again rightly has pointed out that when subsidies are notified, they have to be turned around and approved or disapproved by the CMA within, I think it's 30 days. Entirely right. You need a prompt, nimble, agile response for our economy to work in a prompt, nimble and agile way. But it therefore seems odd, if I can put it politely, that we are allowing the subsidies not to be registered for up to 6 months after they've been made. So what we will have is fewer subsidies being declared in a way which doesn't really match what, for example, local councils already have to declare. So they already have to keep this data. This isn't something which they're going to have to start doing from scratch. They're already having to keep this information already. All they've got to do is to paste it onto a central database. And they also don't have to put it out for 6 months. These are small technical tweaks, Madam Deputy Speaker, but they are central to delivering on the principle which the Secretary of State has rightly enunciated. I'll happily give way.
Was this point, is he not concerned then that the challenge can only be made within 30 days? So a subsidy could be well in place for 6 months, then there's a challenge period of 30 days, by which stage, of course, if there was a challenge, a reasonable challenge, and another body had lost out, it's a bit late anyway, is it not?
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and he's right, particularly because, of course, in the modern digitising economy, everything's moving faster and faster and faster every year. So even if it wasn't a problem before, and I think it probably would have been, I think he's right, it certainly would become one in future as well. So I think there is scope for tightening this piece of the bill technically to deliver on the principle which the Secretary of State has rightly enunciated, both in timing and in the degree of transparency and the level of disclosure, in order to make sure that because we will have nothing to hide, therefore we should not hide it. We should get it all out there and make sure it's available. It will allow armchair auditors... I'll happily give it.
He's making some very, very strong points. I absolutely agree with his points about transparency. I mean, I can see an objection to what he's saying, lowering the threshold down to a few £100 rather than £500,000. Some might say that it might be a burden of red tape attached to that. As I understand it, the costs of doing that are minimal. About £20,000 per annum of having a database that includes pretty much every subsidy.
Well, a really important point that my honourable friend Thurston Moulton has just raised. In fact, he's just led me on to the final point in my speech, because he's absolutely right. And I know that the ministers in the department get this instinctively in the marrow of their bones anyway. He's absolutely right to say that we must not turn this into some bureaucratic red tape burden. In fact, again, one of the chapters in the report which I was asked to write about competition policy talks about reducing red tape burdens, and we all understand that too much of that will slow down even the best company and reduce their competitiveness compared to other countries, companies from other countries as well. So he's absolutely right to be concerned about that. I think in this case, in fact, if we do what I'm suggesting, it should reduce the red tape burden rather than adding to it. And the reason why is because one of the other exemptions, which is I think £325,000, is for a cumulative set of subsidies. So if I have 3 or 4 subsidies granted by 3 or 4 different local councils, or maybe a devolved government and some local councils as well, and they cumulatively add up to £325,000 over a 3-year period, then that has to be declared and everyone has to keep track of it. Now, the way that's going to happen isn't that the individual councils making those grants at the moment, under the existing draft of the bill, they won't be keeping that record because they won't be able to, because they won't know what the other councils have done. So the companies that are getting those grants will have to keep their own records for 3 years. So that's a business burden that we are creating if we don't change this right there. If instead we just said there's one central public database, everything gets put on it, no company has to keep any records whatsoever because it's all out there, it's visible, it's searchable, it's clear, it's transparent, there is no extra business burden at all, and there's minimal, as my honourable friend just pointed out, minimal extra public burden because the local councils and the local devolved administrations and government departments are keeping these records anyway. All they've got to do is to extend the print range on their spreadsheet slightly further down the page in order to or organise their automatic file uploads a little bit more simply, and that's all it's got to do. So it will be minimal, but it will actually avoid creating a new red tape burden if we do it this way around rather than what's currently in the bill. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, with that I will do something unusual for a politician and shut up, other than to say this is a good bill, it's an essential bill, it does some really important things. I'm really pleased to see it coming forward. My right honourable friend is doing precisely the right thing and doing it in the right way. We have one concern about detail. I'm sure that can be ironed out with any luck.